Yeah, I'll jump in. So hello, everybody. Welcome to the IPG Holiday Happy Hour. My name is Larry Law. I'm the Executive Director of the Great Lakes Independent Booksellers Association. Coming from an indie bookstore myself and now working for an association that advocates for and puts on education for indie bookstores, it's really great to work on an event like this with an organization that is built on supporting indie publishers. So thank you all for joining us today. We have 4 great authors tonight from Santa Fe Writers Project and Chicago Review Press. So let's get into it. Our hosts today are from IPG. They are Julia Callahan, Jeff Waxman, and Chris Conti. Julia Callahan is IPG's new trade sales representative west. Julia comes from Rare Bird Books, an indie publisher in Los Angeles, where she wore many hats. Throughout her 10 plus years at Rare Bird Books, she was editor, director of sales, and director of marketing and publicity, and worked very closely with authors and West Coast bookstores. Julia also co-hosts a podcast called Dawson's Critique, great name, and recently co-authored and published I Remember Everything, Life Lessons from Dawson's Creek. Her take on the classic WB teen drama is both hilarious and insightful. Julia sells to independents in the Western states. Next up, Jeff Waxman. Jeff is a familiar name and face to many booksellers in the U.S. Jeff has done time at the Dalkey Archive, the Seminary Co-op, Lyceum Books, University of Chicago Press, Other Press, Oxford University Press, Biblioasis, Tyrant Books, Restless Books, Bookshop.org, The Baffler, and Nautilus, among others. He has produced 2 notable seasons of Book Plates, a well-received literary dinner series in Brooklyn, and most recently held the position of partnership director for House of Speakeasy, a nonprofit that, among other initiatives, developed a bookmobile which seeks to bring literature to communities where few or no bookshops exist. In 2019, the bookmobile journeyed through 14 states and 18 cities across 4,000 miles, offering readings, workshops, and giving away 5,000 plus books along the way. At IPG, Jeff manages sales to indies from top to bottom of the East Coast. And last but not least, Chris Conti. Chris earned an MFA in photography and then immediately fell into a long career as a book buyer for 2 contemporary art museums in the Midwest. He spent 7 plus years representing Phaidon Press to 20 states in the middle of the country. In early 2021, Chris built the first in-house trade sales team in IPG's 50-year history, where he sells to indie bookstores in mostly the Midwest. He also oversees the sales efforts of the 3-person IPG indie trade sales team. Chris hosts the John Cage Bubblegum, a weekly radio show streaming at radio614.org, and is based in Columbus, Ohio. And I'll also add, Chris is the newest member of the GLIBA board, and we are thrilled to have him. And right now, before we get into the event, I'd like to turn it over to Heather Duncan. Heather is the Executive Director of the Mountains and Plains Independent Booksellers Association. As many of you probably know, MPIBA held their fall trade show in person this year, something myself and fellow regional associations were very excited to see and follow along the way. We're hoping to return to in-person programming in 2022, but I'd like to invite Heather up to tell us a little bit about that and their work with IPG.
Thank you, Larry. That's an amazing introduction for everyone. I don't want to take too much time, but I did want to thank our IPG folks for including Larry and I in this cool happy hour. I just realized I didn't get myself some happy, so I might have to go and do that before the authors. Exactly, Mr. Waxman. So, but I did want to say that the trade show this year, which was a gamble that we took to have the in-person show, turned out, it was really an amazing experience. And a lot of that had to do with the IPG team and the amazing booth that they set up and the books that they had there. The booksellers were so excited to see the small presses that they could start working with. We have, throughout the pandemic, and Larry and my regional colleagues are all feeling the same way about this, really took the opportunity to work with smaller presses in a way that we all hadn't been doing as much as we should have in the past. And I think that the pandemic allowed us, because of virtual, and then now being back, thank goodness, in person, allowed us to really explore those relationships. And we're just thrilled to be working with IPG on these types of things and everything moving forward, and just love their presses and their amazing books. So I can't wait to hear this event today, and I'm just glad to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, you guys. That was great. Yeah, so I want to raise a glass or a fist or whatever you feel like raising. This is our first year as an indie trade sales team, and I'm really enjoying being able to work really closely with all of the indies. So thanks so much for showing up, everybody. Chin chin. Yeah, thanks. I want to remind everybody also, so we're doing these Zoom calls monthly. We just started last month. And kind of the reason for this more casual happy hour was we spent about an hour and a half going through the spring catalog, and I can't believe it, but there were plenty of people who stayed for the entire 90 minutes. So I wanted to just make this December one a little bit looser and just highlight a few books that we as a team really collectively responded to out of thousands that we sell each season. I also want to remind everybody, buyers that are here, that we have that Indies First promo, which is through the end of the year. You get a 48% discount and free freight on an order of $100. So hopefully that makes it somewhat worth your time here. Not that we need to entice you, but also Margaret Gay, who joined the call. Say hello, Margaret. She is going to put her email in the chat, and I promised you all your choice of the 4 authors' books. So please email her and tell her which one you would like to show up in your mailbox. And so, yeah, we're going to be doing these monthly. So keep your eyes peeled. And then for the January one, and then we're excited to also see you at Winter Institute. If you're able to join that in February in Cincinnati, just a little, not too far away from me. The first of tonight's chat is with 2 Santa Fe Writers Project authors. Lilly Dancyger's Negative Space came out this past May. It chronicles her father's struggle with addiction amid his budding career in the East Village art scene of the 80s. And while those 2 things don't really seem like strange bedfellows, drugs and the visual arts in 80s New York, I haven't really ever read an account from a child growing up in this scene. And it had me thinking about subculture and sort of identity. I don't really get a sense of victimhood in Lilly's book, which is super refreshing. There's definitely fond memories amid what could seem like a rough environment. And Lilly, I wondered if the impetus of this book came from wanting to tell your story or telling your father's story, or kind of figuring it out as you went along. Was it an attempt to say I'm okay or say I'm not okay?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for inviting us to be here. It's such a great opportunity to get to speak to you all. And yeah, originally, when I set out to write Negative Space, I wanted to tell my father's story and I wanted to share his artwork with the world. So it wasn't even about myself originally, but it became kind of more of a memoir as I went. And when I realized, that the artist monograph I wanted to write was not going to be as marketable as a memoir, I kind of took a Trojan horse approach rather than just scrapping my initial idea. And the result is kind of an art book inside of a memoir, which is something a little different and unusual, but people have really been responding to that kind of genre bending aspect of it. And also, as you noted, I think another thing that's different about it is the way that it handles the addiction narrative. It was really important to me not to allow my father's heroin addiction to define him in the story. And as I wrote in the book, that's never the first thing that I think of when I remember him. And I didn't want it to be the first thing that readers learned about him either. And so I worked hard to portray him as a multidimensional, lovable, complicated, frustrating, brilliant person who struggled with addiction, as opposed to, the one-dimensional addict character that sometimes pops up. I couldn't ignore the drug aspect of the story, of course, and the pain that it caused in our family. So it is part of the story, but I tried not to let it overshadow everything else and to allow it to also be all of the other kinds of stories that it is. It's a coming of age story also of me in the East Village in the early 2000s and that punk scene, which kind of grew out of the scene my father was a part of, but was also very different, and honoring all the different aspects of it. And that's, maybe I'll kick it over to Chris if you want to talk about I'm Not Hungry, But I Could Eat. Or Chris, are you going to introduce him first?
Well, yeah. So luckily, Lilly and Chris know each other, and Chris's new short story collection just came out last week. So we're really excited to have him here. It's called I'm Not Hungry, But I Could Eat. And yeah, I was sort of talking about when I talked with Lilly and Chris about this call tonight. I was, sort of interested in subculture, which isn't really. I feel like that's a very like 90s word that doesn't really get used anymore. But yeah, and so I kind of wanted to talk about that sort of stuff. But Lilly, what did you guys come up with?
Well, we were kind of just going to talk about what set it apart and kind of go back and forth with a couple questions for each other.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'll just kick that over to Chris if you want to tell everybody what sets I'm Not Hungry, But I Could Eat apart from the pack.
Yeah, thank you, Lilly and Chris, and thank you all for joining us and for inviting us. It feels really special to be here. I guess what makes, I'm Not Hungry, But I Could Eat special, or to me feel special, it still feels kind of refreshing to read about, like queer, Latinx, specifically Puerto Rican, specifically bisexual, this perspective on like dating and sex and friendship and being in your 20s in contemporary adult fiction. I think I see a lot of it in YA, which is great, but it's still, I want to gobble up every sort of adult book that covers these themes. And, also all the main characters in my collection, right, are fat. And that was very important to me. And the book shows, these fat queer men in like a mundane existence, which I think is beautiful, right? The book also attempts to grapple with these overlapping identities, right? In the ways that they contradict, in the ways that they sort of share these similarities, without ever being, or without, I hope, ever being didactic or over-explaining about like what it is to be a person of, Puerto Rican descent, what it is to be a fat queer person of Puerto Rican descent. And I do feel like, it speaks in community, right? I feel like there's a sense of like, if you know, you know. But having said that, right, I think there are themes that are familiar to readers outside of the community, outside of those communities, more broadly, loneliness and striving to find connection, longing for something more in life, hunger in life that is, insatiable. And so I'm curious, Lilly, how did you think about your book in relation to a wider audience outside of, this like subculture, art scene, New York City? It's a very like New York City, early 2000s, right? Setting, time and place, but how do you, think about your book outside of that context and appealing to readers who might not know?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I love that. If you know, you know, and that's kind of the approach that I took as well with the kind of in-group stuff. I didn't explain what pyramid is or what the sidewalk cafe is, and if you know, you know, and if you don't know, you can pick it up in context. You also reminded me that I should show everybody the book cover. But yeah, I thought as well about making sure that even though it's very specific to a time and a place, and I'm digging deep into specific characters in my father's story and in my family, I also wanted it to connect to a larger audience as well. And I think actually the search element of the story is maybe the most universally relatable. Even if most people don't go to the lengths that I went, of researching their parents. I interviewed 24 people over the course of a decade and put myself through a lot of really uncomfortable, frank conversations, with the man my mom cheated with and the woman my father left for my mother. And, most people might not go all the way there, but I think that desire that sparked that search, that wanting to know where you come from and wanting to know your family and your past, that's something that everybody can relate to for the most part. I'm, whether we go looking for it or not, we all eventually have to confront our parents' humanity in one way or another. Most of the time we don't see it coming, right? Those big shifts in our relationships with our parents. But I went looking for it because with my father gone, it wasn't going to happen by surprise. In conversation with him, I was only going to have those realizations if I went and sought them out. But I've heard from a lot of readers that seeing me grapple on the page with what it means to see both my parents as humans really helped them to do that too. It was also especially important for me to show the universal elements of my relationships with my parents, because as you mentioned, Chris, there's so much stigma around addiction. Most people going into it probably would assume that being raised by two heroin addicts was a grim, kind of a hideous tragedy, and that they couldn't possibly have been good parents, but in a lot of ways they were, right? So that I think kind of touches on that subculture issue and representation. And it's hard enough to tell your own story well, but when you're also speaking for a community or a group of people that have been villainized or ignored, there's an added layer of pressure to really do it right and to show the humanity and to show the aspects that are universal and they're not so different from what a reader might experience. And I know that that idea of speaking for community and the pressure of that is something you can speak to as well, Chris.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting, right? Because you're writing about like lived experience and memoir, and I approach my book project with fiction, though, I won't deny that it's heavily influenced by real life experiences, but it is, fiction. And that same question came up, how to write about people, who sort of the dominant majority or whatever has very, whether like stereotype ideas about Latino men or like preconceived notions about what it means to be fat, what it means to be queer, how to write about those identities. But I think I had to throw away any sort of like, pressure to quote unquote get it right on the page while working on these stories. I'm not a representative for any individual community, for any overlapping community. And I don't think fiction sort of can do what fiction needs to do if you're sort of worried about, getting it right or portraying people in these as these paradigms of virtue. I want to show people in all their messy glory, and I couldn't worry about what people outside of these communities thought or even worry that maybe I was in some way handing over ammunition that could be used against people of color or Latinx people or queer people. My job, I like to think of it as just to write characters who are allowed to breathe on the page. And when I did think about negative stereotypes of Latino men in particular, right? I also had to think about what happens when you then introduce queerness or introduce fatness, and how does it sort of complicate that, right? What happens when you introduce softness and insecurity and interiority to a figure in literature that isn't always given that sort of just isn't given that space to sort of exist in, as Lilly was talking about, a full spectrum of what it means to be a human. And so I think my responsibility to an audience, both people for whom or with whom I share an identity and people outside of that, is just to write authentically and allow for the characters on the page to just be these complicated and sometimes contradictory figures. Yeah, I think that was the conversation.
What you just said is how I link both of your books is just that, not afraid of being two-dimensional when it calls for it, not afraid of being three-dimensional, not afraid of being overly serious, not afraid of finding the humor in inappropriate things that are, yeah, that's how I link the two of your books, even though, you know, one's memoir and one's fiction. So thanks, that was great. Lorraine, I think we're going to talk to you next. Lorraine's Brewhouse, The Magic and Power of Witches of Color, came out from Chicago Review Press. What's it been, like 2 months, Lorraine?
Yeah, October 5th.
Yeah. So, and I think Jeff has some questions for you. You're muted, Jeff.
Have I questions? I have questions. I mentioned earlier that I was just in St. Petersburg, I think. Most of you were here selling the spring list into Lorraine's home store. But what I didn't say was that Tombolo, which is the name of the shop in St. Petersburg, it's a total dream, really. I love that place. It kind of has an altar built to Lorraine.
I know, it's weird.
there's a stack of her book, faced out, of course. Clippings from the local paper taped to the wall. You bring her up to any staff member and they'll cross themselves and then, you know, make the sign of the evil eye. No, nothing like that. But outside of the Tampa metro area, her book is still really popular. I've got booksellers in New York and Connecticut, the Carolinas, basically everywhere I go. It was one of the big hits of our season. And I don't think it's just because witchcraft is trendy per se, but also because Lorraine's offering something a little bit unusual here. It's not a how-to so much as a bit of memoir and some other things mixed in. And I think that'd be a great place to start with. Lorraine, what kind of threads have you wound together for this, from your own experience and from, you know, the history and I guess I've been comparing it a little bit to Adrienne Marie Brown a little bit in terms of the radical aspects looking forward.
Wow.
But feel free.
Well, she's one of my heroes, so thank you. I'm humbled. Not as great as she, I think. But this is the book. This light makes me ghostly. I'm never on Zoom. My girlfriend has this set up. And am I still good?
Well,
IPG has started screen sharing.
What's up with that, do you think? Chris, that's you.
Yep. I'm stopping sharing. I just
Okay.
Okay.
Cool.
All right.
All right. So thank you so much for having me. I feel just honored to be included in this group of authors. I think to answer your question, Jeff, I felt that in writing this book, I needed to include as many stories as possible because it is, I didn't want to go into it giving one-dimensional definition of what a bruja is, because we're all from so many different traditions. So this was a jump-off point from my dissertation research over the last decade about the reclamation of ancestral traditions. And I saw a lot of books on witchcraft, a lot of wonderful books about the link between witchcraft and feminism, but many of them were missing the parallel journey of the bruja, which is a word that has been reclaimed to include many different people from different traditions across the African diaspora and the Latin Americas. And there are just very different kinds of traditions and histories, though they do parallel a lot of the European witchcraft histories. So, traditionally, brujeria and brujas wasn't a word that we would use in a good light. It had a negative connotation. And many of these people who hail from these traditions would never have considered it witchcraft in the past. But what's happening is this new generation of mostly millennials, Gen Z, who are coming up as the second and third generations in their family of immigrants who came to the country, are feeling a gap in their histories as they look back to what their abuelitas did in their home countries, and wondering what happened to that thread in assimilation to this country and to Catholicism mostly. A lot of those threads have been lost. So this new generation of people calling themselves Bruja or Brujex, the gender non-conforming term, is all about quote unquote reclaiming these traditions that have fallen off, that may have not been passed down. Some of them have. So the reason that I'd like to include, every chapter includes a different person's story, is that some of them have been initiated all the way through their family life, but some haven't. Some have been told that this stuff that we used to practice back home is bad, and have been left with not much to go on, which is my personal experience. So I offer the book as a platform for the story of the Bruja as it is unfolding, because we're still writing what it is to be a Bruja in this country. And so, yes, I weave a lot of different kinds of narratives, and my own memoir about growing up in Miami, kind of like on the border of the Everglades, which is a scene I think that is very little represented in literature. So I was hoping to paint it a little bit, this very suburban wasteland right on top of a beautiful swampland that has been paved over, and the magic that's underneath the ground, which is something I think that we all share as Bruja Brujex, this yearning to return to land that we never knew. And so reclaiming for us is really also, since we can't go back to something we never had, about creating something new and creating new magic and new histories together and new definitions about what it means to be a Latinx immigrant in this country. And as a white Latina, as you can see, I look very Caucasian myself, so I thought it was really important.
We prefer ethereal Latina today.
This light is not helping. I thought, and I have definitely benefited from the privilege of passing as, a European descendant, or a person who's been here for many generations. So I thought it was really important to include many stories and many voices, and I offered this book up for anyone who wanted to be included and to tell their story. So each chapter is like a little platform for each of the stories of the people I spent the last few years getting to know and talking to.
Do I get to ask more questions? What else is going on here, Chris? What's on your agenda?
It's up to you. Or I can move on to Tara.
Well, we'll talk to Tara. Maybe we'll come back to Lorraine. I don't want to.
Yeah.
I don't want.
The thing that I told Lorraine when we talked earlier is that all season, I think the three of us have been selling Brewhouse and Brewhouse.
Yeah,
which has been fun
Brewhouse
since we're both from Chicago Review Press. But Tara's book is called A Woman's Place is in the Brewhouse: A Forgotten History of Alewives, Brewsters, Witches, and CEOs. And Julia, who you have met Tara before, is gonna ask her a question about your book.
Yeah, so hi guys, I'm Julia, and I'm here in Los Angeles, which I would consider freezing right now, but is like 65. And so I wanted to say, when I first saw A Woman's Places in the Brewhouse on our list, I was super excited because I spent all of my 20s going to every brewery I possibly could. Every time I traveled anywhere, I made sure to go to a brewery, and I still spend a lot of time in them, though less than I did in my 20s. And I grew up in the Bay Area, and, I cover the Western United States, and I was like, I literally I just like put the title of this book in front of people, and I'm like, you need it, obviously, clearly you need it. But when I was reading it, what I really loved, and what I think is just so fascinating is it's a woman's history, and it's women's history in a way that we don't really get women's history all that much. And so my question for Tara is, what I loved about this book is that it's both sort of modern women's history in that it looks at and interviews some of the women that are responsible for this new sort of resurgence of craft brewing in the US in the past 20 years or so. but it's also a much deeper history into the role of women in beer brewing for the last few centuries, and even maybe millennia. And so I wanted to know, like, what do you hope people take away from both that modern history and more distant history when reading your book? Because I think the two work so interestingly together, and as a sort of story of women and women's economic freedom, and then the suppression of women's economic freedom throughout the centuries.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. Hi, everybody. Well, one of the things I think is important about the book, and what I tell people who aren't necessarily into beer, but I'm hoping will buy the book anyway, is that it's not necessarily, I mean, it is the history of women in beer, but you don't have to be interested in beer to care about this story, because what it really is the history of the patriarchy and how women, I use 200,000 years as the starting point for women brewing beer, but you know, people argue with me a couple 100,000 years either way. Women were the original brewers as far as anybody can tell, and in every single civilization throughout time and space where beer has been brewed and consumed as the staple nutritional beverage for the family, which is most of them, which we don't even know in this country, women have been responsible for it. And so, you know, it's largely throughout human history been this women's chore, right? You got to brew beer along with like making the dinner and all doing all the stuff that women do in the household. And every time that there's some hint of like profit or prestige, or there's like technological or scientific progress, women get booted out and men take over. And it's been going on like that for, like I said, possibly hundreds of thousands of years, until the craft beer industry started in 1976. And women have started kicking that door back in. So it's like this almost reclamation of a proud heritage for women that even women in brewing themselves don't know very much about at all. And whether we're talking about these ancient women, Julia, who you mentioned, or contemporary women who are now in their 80s, who actually started the craft beer industry, which, as we know, is a global phenomenon at this point. And by the way, beer is the second most consumed beverage on the planet after tea. So yeah, whether it's these women who have been instrumental in this industry who literally nobody has ever heard of, or whether we're talking about sort of 20-something women just getting into the industry now, the book is really giving these women a sense that they're not isolated, that they actually do get to rightfully claim this. You know, there's so many ways where there's gatekeeping involved in brewing at best. I mean, we just had the Me Too movement hit craft beer, which a lot of you probably read about. You know, some of the stories coming out are terrible, and women are leaving the industry in droves because the workplace is not very comfortable for us. And I'm a little bit all over the place because I'm so excited to talk to you all. I'm like, what do I want to get across? Yeah, so there's the sense of I belong here. Oh, and what I was going to say about the gatekeeping was a more subtle, a more benign way that women are sort of emotionally excluded from the industry is the constant questions women get. Let's say you're a beer tender at a brewery. Julia, you've encountered many. Do you even like beer? Do you drink beer? And, you know, they might be asking, forget being a beer tender, they might be asking the female owner of the brewery or the brewer, do you know anything about beer? So, I mean, it can be, it's like a constant microaggression, right, at best. And so what I'm really seeing as I travel the country touring to promote this book, and Julia, I'm actually coming out west tomorrow for 3 weeks for the final leg of 2021. Like, I'm getting so much gratitude. Like, I've had women cry. I've had women tell me I finally feel seen. I've had women tell me they circled the date of the release on their calendar, and then the date again of when it was supposed to get in the mail. I think a lot of that is, oh wow, I actually do belong in this industry. That was a very long-winded answer, sorry.
No, I love it. Can I ask one follow-up question? Which is, do you have a favorite brewery? And is there, we're all friends here, we won't leak this. And do you have a favorite kind of beer, or is there a specific beer that you like the best?
So I'll start with the style first. I really love Mexican stouts. Raise your hand if you know what a Mexican stout is. Yeah, a lot of people are nodding. Okay, it's a new style, at least in craft brewing terms, and it's not very common. So a Mexican stout is like an Aztec drinking chocolate. It's a big sweet stout, which is like, you know, Guinness is a stout, those dark malty beers, but it's got like cinnamon and chocolate and hot pepper and nutmeg and what am I forgetting? Like all kinds of crazy stuff. So those are delicious, and I will never turn one down. I don't have a favorite brewery. Because there's so many, like I just overthink the answer too much, you know. Well, you know, do you mean as far as like view or the beer or the people? I am about to go do an event at Russian River Brewing in Sonoma County, which is my happy place on earth. And that's like #1 cult brewery in the country, maybe. And Natalie Chilurzo is hosting me. She's the co-owner, and everybody, her husband's like this god. Everyone wants to talk to Vinny, and like they all shove Natalie aside, you know. But here, I'm really excited to showcase her at the event. And then I'm going to be doing that at all my events, like showcasing some of the local women who, you know, are making beer happen in their market.
Perfect.
And that's why I don't have a beer. I'm the alcohol writer in this group, and I am not drinking anything because I'm leaving tomorrow morning for Portland and I have a lot to do. So no beer until tomorrow.
I think Peter just chugged a giant beer of some kind, maybe. Well, thanks a lot, everybody. I promised myself and everyone that I would keep this one short since the last one went 90 minutes. But happy holidays to all of you. Don't forget to email Margaret for your book choice, and Lily and Chris, I know you guys are taking off for a while, so good luck to both of you, and thanks a lot.
Thanks so much. It's
Bye,
great talking
everybody.
to you all. Bye.
Nice to
Thanks,
see you
guys.
all.
Thanks for being here.
Bye, folks.